This is Department of English, Government Postgraduate College, Attak. This session is for online classes. I am Muhammad Ali, lecturer in English. Today is 11th August 2020. This online class is for MA English Part 1. This is paper 3 and it is first novel first from the University of Punjab. This is the title page of the novel Pride and Prejudice, composed by Jane Austen. Let us start with the details about the life of Jane Austen. Introduction of Jane Austen. She was a novelist of the Romantic age, and the Romantic age was from 1798 to 1824. I would like to share some information about biography of Jane Austen, and that information will be discussed under the following headings. First heading is Jane Austen's birth, then Jane Austen's parentage, Jane Austen's family life, Jane Austen's education, Jane Austen and Tom Lefroy, Jane Austen's residence in Bath and Southampton, Jane Austen and her marriage proposal, Jane Austen and her financial problems, Jane Austen's residence in Chawton, Jane Austen's illness and death. This is the picture of Jane Austen. This is the portrait of Jane Austen that was in 1810. This is house of Jane Austen, 4 Sydney Place, Bath. This picture is the picture of cottage in Chawton where Jane Austen lived during her last 8 years of life, now Jane Austen's House Museum. This is another picture. It is picture of 8 College Street in Winchester where Austen lived her last days and died. Biography of Jane Austen. Jane Austen was born on 16 December 1775 and she died on 18th July 1817. She was an English novelist known primarily for her 6 major novels which interpret, critique or assess critically and comment upon the British landed gentry at the end of the 18th century. There is little biographical information about Jane Austen's life except the few letters that survived and the biographical notes her family members wrote. During her lifetime, Jane Austen may have written as many as 3,000 letters, but only 161 survived. Jane Austen wrote many letters to her elder sister Cassandra, who in 1843 burned the greater part of them and cut pieces out of those she kept. Cassandra destroyed or censored Jane Austen's letters to prevent their falling into the hands of relatives and ensuring that their nieces could not read any of Jane Austen's bitter or straightforward comments on neighbors or family members. Cassandra believed that in the interest of diplomacy and Jane's desire for directness, these details should be destroyed. The lack of record of Austen's life leaves modern biographers little with which to work. Jane Austen's birth. Jane Austen was born in Steventon, Hampshire on 16 December 1775. Her father wrote of her arrival in a letter that her birth was welcomed as a future companion to her sister. The winter of 1776 was particularly harsh, and it was not until 5th April that she was baptized at the local church with the single name Jane. Jane Austen's parentage. The name of Jane Austen's father is George Austen, who was from 1731 to 1805. He served as the rector or priest of the Anglican parishes or rural community at Steventon and at nearby Dean. He came from an old, respected and wealthy family of wool merchants. Over the centuries, as each generation of the eldest sons received inheritances or family properties, their wealth was combined, and George Austen's branch of the family means his children and his family fell into poverty because he and his two sisters were orphans as children and they had to be taken in by relatives. George Austen's sister Philadelphia went to India to find a husband, and George entered St. John's College, Oxford on a fellowship where he met Cassandra Lee. Cassandra Lee was from 1739 to 1827 and she was mother of Jane Austen. She came from the prominent Lee family. Her father was rector or priest at All Souls College, Oxford, where she grew up among the gentry. Her eldest brother, James, inherited or got a fortune and large estate from his great aunt Parrot, with the only condition that he should change his name to Lee Parrot. George Austen and Cassandra Lee, parents of Jane Austen, were engaged in 1763. George received the living for the Steventon parish from the wealthy husband of his second cousin, Thomas Knight, who owned Steventon and its associated farms, one of which the Austen family rented to live in. 2 months after Cassandra's father died, they married on 26 April 1764 at St. Swithin's Church in Bath, by lessons in a simple ceremony. They left for Hampshire the same day. Their income was modest and meager and small, with George Austen's small per annum or annual living. Cassandra brought to the marriage the expectation of a small inheritance or family property at the time of her mother's death. The Austens took up temporary residence at the nearby Dean Rectory until Steventon, a 16th century house in disrepair, underwent necessary renovations or repair. Jane Austen's residence in Steventon in 1768, the family finally took up residence in Steventon. In 1773, Cassandra, elder sister of Jane Austen, was born, whereas Jane was born in 1775. According to Honan, who is a critic, the atmosphere of the Austen home was an open, amused, easy, intellectual one, where the ideas of those with whom the Austens might disagree politically or socially were considered and discussed. The family depended on the patronage of their kin and relatives and hosted visits from numerous or many family members. From 1773 until 1796, George Austen, means Jane Austen's father, added his income by farming and by teaching 3 or 4 boys at a time who boarded at his home. He had an annual income of £200 from his 2 livings. This was a very modest and small income at the time by comparison. A skilled worker like a blacksmith or a carpenter could make about £100 annually, while the typical annual income of a gentry family was between £1,000 and £5,000. During this period of her life, Jane Austen attended church regularly, socialized with friends and neighbors, and read novels, often of her own composition, aloud to her family in the evenings. Socializing with the neighbors often meant dancing either in someone's home after supper or evening meal or at the balls, means formal dancing parties held regularly at the assembly rooms in the town hall. Her brother Henry later said that Jane Austen was fond of dancing and excelled in it. Jane Austen was a very good dancer. In 1783, now I am talking about education of Jane Austen. In 1783, Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra were sent to Oxford to be educated by Mrs. Anne Colley, who took them with her to Southampton when she moved there later in the year. In the autumn, both girls were sent home when they caught typhus, and Jane Austen became seriously ill. From then, Jane Austen was home educated until she attended boarding school in Reading with her sister from early in 1785 at the Reading Abbey Girls' School. The school curriculum probably included some French, spelling, needlework, dancing, music, and drama. The sisters returned home before December 1786 because the school fees for the two girls were too high for the Austen family. After 1786, Jane Austen never again lived anywhere beyond the bounds of her immediate family environment. The remainder of her education came from reading, guided by her father and brothers, James and Henry. Irene Collins believes that Jane Austen used some of the same school books as the boys her father tutored. Jane Austen had access both to her father's library and that of a family friend, Warren Hastings. Her father was also tolerant of Jane Austen's experiments in writing and provided both sisters with expensive paper and other materials for their writing and drawing. Private theatricals were an essential part of Jane Austen's education. From her early childhood, the family and friends staged a series of plays in the rectory or church house, barn or shelter or shed, including Richard Sheridan's The Rivals, that was written in 1775, and David Garrick's Bon Ton, that was a play. Jane Austen's eldest brother James wrote the prologues and epilogues, and she probably joined in these activities first as a spectator and later as a participant. Mostly these plays were comedies, which suggests and indicates how Jane Austen's satirical gifts were developed or cultivated. At the age of 12, she tried her own hand at dramatic writing. She wrote 3 short plays during her teenage years. Jane Austen and Tom Lefroy. When Jane Austen was 20, Tom Lefroy, a neighbor, visited Steventon from December 1795 to January 1796. He had just finished a university degree and was moving to London for training as a barrister or lawyer. Lefroy and Jane Austen would have been introduced at a ball or formal dance party or other neighborhood social gathering, and it is clear from Jane Austen's letters to her sister Cassandra that they spent considerable time together. I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate or spendthrift and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together. These words were written by Jane Austen. Jane Austen wrote in her first surviving letter to her sister Cassandra that Lefroy was a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man. 5 days later, in another letter, Jane Austen wrote that she expected an offer from her friend, means Lefroy, and that I shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat, going on to white, I will confide, disclose So she wrote 5 days later in another letter, Jane Austen wrote another letter that she expected an offer from her friend, means Lefroy, and then again she wrote, I shall refuse him, however, Jane Austen wrote in a letter, and these are exact words written by Jane Austen: I shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat. Going on to write, I will confide, means disclose myself in the future to Mr. Tom Lefroy, for whom I don't give a sixpence, and refuse all others. The next day, Jane Austen wrote, the day will come on which I flirt my last with Tom Lefroy, and when you receive this, it will be all over. My tears flow as I write at this melancholy idea. Melancholy means sad idea. Jane Austen often satirized popular, sentimental, romantic fiction or novel in her letters, and some of the statements about Lefroy may have been ironic. However, it is clear that Jane Austen was genuinely attracted to Lefroy, and subsequently none of her other suitors ever quite measured up to him. Means the people who wanted to marry Jane Austen, they were not equal to this Lefroy. The Lefroy family intervened and sent him away at the end of January. Marriage was impractical, as both Tom Lefroy and Jane Austen must have known. Neither had any money, and he was dependent on a great uncle in Ireland to finance his education and establish his legal career. If Tom Lefroy later visited Hampshire, he was carefully kept away from the Austens, and Jane Austen never saw him again. In November 1798, Lefroy was still in Austen's mind. As she wrote to her sister, she had tea with one of his relatives, wanted desperately to ask about Lefroy, but could not bring herself to raise the subject, means the topic. In December 1800, Jane Austen took residence in Bath and Southampton. In December 1800, George Austen announced his decision. George Austen, father of Jane Austen, he decided to get retirement from the ministry. He decided to leave Steventon, and he decided to move the family to 4th Sydney Place in Bath. The retirement and the travel were good for the elder Austens, parents of Jane Austen, but Jane Austen was shocked when she listened that she was moving from the only home she had ever known. She faced her lack of productivity as a writer during the time she lived at Bath. Tomalin suggests this reflects a deep depression, disabling her as a writer, but Honan, another critic, disagrees, arguing Jane Austen wrote or revised her manuscript or scripts or handwritten material throughout her creative life, except for a few months after her father died. It is often claimed that Jane Austen was unhappy in Bath, which caused her to lose interest in writing, but it is just as possible that Jane Austen's social life in Bath prevented her from spending much time writing novels. The critic Robert Irwin argued if Jane Austen spent more time writing novels when she was in the countryside, it might just have been because she had more spare time as opposed to being more happy in the countryside, as is often argued. Furthermore, Jane Austen frequently both moved and travelled over southern England during this period, which was hardly a conducive or favorable environment for writing a long novel. Jane Austen and her marriage proposal. In December 1802, Jane Austen received her only known proposal of marriage. She and her sister visited Elithie and Catherine Begg, old friends who lived near Basingstoke. Their young brother, Harris Bigwither, had recently finished his education at Oxford and was also at home. Harris Bigwither proposed and Jane Austen accepted. As described by Caroline Austen, Jane's niece, and Reginald Bigwither, a descendant or a child, Harris was not attractive. He was a large, plain-looking man who spoke little, stuttered or stumbled or hesitated when he did speak. He was aggressive in conversation and almost completely tactless. He had no manners. However, Jane Austen had known him since both were young, and the marriage offered many practical advantages to Jane Austen and her family. Harris was the heir to extensive family estates. He was a rich man. The family estates located in the area where the sisters had grown up. With these resources, Jane Austen could provide her parents a comfortable old age, give Cassandra a permanent home, and perhaps assist her brothers in their careers. By the next morning, Jane Austen realized she had made a mistake and withdrew her acceptance. No contemporary letters or diaries describe how Jane Austen felt about this proposal. Irving described Harris Bigwither as somebody who seems to have been a man very hard to like, let alone love. In 1814, Jane Austen wrote a letter to her niece, Fanny Knight, who had asked for advice about a serious relationship, telling her that having written so much on one side of the question, I shall now turn around and entreat you not to commit yourself further and not to think of accepting him unless you really do like him. Anything is to be preferred or endeavored rather than marrying without affection. The English scholar Douglas Bush wrote that Jane Austen had a very high ideal of the love that should unite a husband and wife. All of her heroines know in proportion to their maturity the meaning of ardent love. Jane Austen's financial problems. Jane Austen's father suddenly died. That left Jane, Cassandra, and their mother in a precarious and insecure financial situation. For the next 4 years, the family's living arrangements reflected their financial insecurity. They spent part of the time in rented quarters in Bath before leaving the city in June 1805 for a family visit to Steventon and Godmersham. They moved for the autumn months to the newly fashionable seaside resort of Worthing on the Sussex coast, where they resided at Stanford Cottage. In 1806, the family moved to Southampton, where they shared a house with Frank Austen and his new wife. A large part of this time they spent visiting various branches of the family. Jane Austen's residence in Chawton. Around early 1809, Jane Austen's brother Edward offered his mother and sisters a more settled life, the use of a large cottage in Chawton village that was part of Edward's nearby estate, Chawton House. Jane, Cassandra, and their mother moved into Chawton Cottage on 7th July 1809. Life was quieter and peaceful in Chawton than it had been since the family's moved to Bath in 1800. The Austens did not socialize the gentry and entertained only when family visited. Her niece Anna described the family's life in Chawton as, besides the housekeeping, our aunts occupied themselves in working with the poor and in teaching some girls or boys to read or write. Jane Austen's illness and death. Jane Austen was feeling unwell by early 1816 but ignored the warning signs. By the middle of that year, her decline was unmistakable and she began a slow, irregular deterioration. The majority of biographers list her cause of death as Addison disease, although her final illness has also been described as resulting from Hodgkin's lymphoma when her uncle died and left his entire fortune to his wife, effectively disinheriting his relatives. She suffered a relapse or setback, writing, I am ashamed to say that the shock of my uncle's will brought on a relapse, but a weak body must excuse weak nerves. She put down her pen on 18th March 1817, making a note of it. Jane Austen made light of her condition, describing it as bile, as rheumatism. As her illness progressed, she experienced difficulty walking and lacked energy. By mid-April, she was confined to bed. In May, Cassandra and Henry brought her to Winchester, for treatment, by which time she suffered agonizing pain and welcomed death. Jane Austen died in Winchester on 18 July 1817 at the age of 41. Henry, through his clerical connections, arranged for his sister to be buried in the north aisle or a walkway of the nave or the central part of Winchester Cathedral or church. The epitaph means a phrase or inscription on tombstone in memory of dead that was composed by her brother James, who praises Jane Austen's personal qualities, expresses hope for her salvation, and mentions the extraordinary endowments of her mind. Thank you very much.